Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. This is episode 126 of The Roundtable. This is also the first time The Roundtable will be streaming to X. So, for any X viewers, happy to have you here for the first time. I'm once again joined by Keith Preston and Florian. This is going to be a little bit of a speculative episode. It's called The Rise of a New Class. So, I have a somewhat prepared introduction. And then once I finish it, I'll then hand it out to Keith and Florian to sort of give me their thoughts. So the current reigning paradigm now is the bourgeoisie. Their power is rooted in externalizing the cost of production and maintaining their own infrastructure to the state, seeking to manipulate the political to get what you want. A banking system rooted in debt with payments to be paid in future expected economic growth hides itself and its motives behind the culture war, which is a frozen conflict led by counter-gangs. Suppresses labor by employing women and immigrants. Many of these measures are fraying at the ends. The smoke screen is disappearing. The true existence and nature of capital makes it easier to see and identify. Prior movements that could have directly challenged capital were destroyed via the culture war tactics or in earlier days with brute force. As economic growth slows and stalls, the debt engine is being pushed to breaking point. At some point, there will not be enough future economic growth to service the debt and game over. The culture war has bifurcated America into two groups. Group one, they take the culture war narrative too far and are waging a battle that might actually harm the delicate balance that was set up. For example, what the woke has done. And then the MAGA response to the woke. And then two, people are beginning to see through the culture war and see who the man really behind the curtain. Employing women and immigrants has the dual problem of reducing fertility rates and heightening ethnic tensions, both of which could individually wreck the existing system. Lastly, the radical sense of alienation and dislocation experienced by modern man is feeding into mental health crisis, which for all appearances is moving toward a pandemic. All the old tools are running out of utility. Couple this with declining EROIs across all forms of energy production, and the material conditions that we are living in will trend towards austerity, something we have witnessed since 2007. As this system needs a high energy state to exist in, a lower energy state is developing. It will struggle and I argue fail. We saw this in Afghanistan. The unit cost for actions by the Taliban were cheaper in energy costs than the US. So, for example, imagine every patrol by a Taliban insurgent versus every patrol by a US Army Ranger. Who's going to consume more energy? We know it's the US Army Ranger. Eventually, the US decided it could not pay for such endeavors and withdrew. One might speculate capital negates itself by closing the last corporate building because it cannot keep the books out of the red. As thought precedes action and the exercise of the will precedes human decisions, a crippled mind equals a crippled body where no one can act, and that feeds into the mental health crisis. So with all this already laid out, I argue that the bourgeoisie is facing crises that it is not able to handle or able to deal with. Then that begs the question if the bourgeoisie is to be replaced by some other class. And I think that's a reasonable assumption, as no human ruling class lasts forever. And assuming the world doesn't end tomorrow, there will be some post-bourgeoisie ruling class. What might that look like? So this is where I bring on some of my own speculative ideas. With all of these conditions thus described, the debt crisis, the culture war smokescreen dissipating, culture wars went into hardcore mode where they fight each other rather than preserve the system. Reduced fertility rates, ethnic tensions, and declining EROIs, what class might emerge under such pressure? Let us provisionally call this class mental aristocrats. Without going into too much detail, I have discussed the possibility of a future mental science based on my own reading of philosophy, 19th century literature, and the sci-fi. Gotta love Isaac Asimov. That a new science of mind could develop that will give man a more power over himself and the material world by a greater understanding of the mental. As physical energy sources are tapped out, selection pressures will exist for mental and spiritual sources of energy and motivation. The mental health crisis will put pressures on any new class to develop bulletproof minds. This will be done by rooting one's mind in things that are permanent and not the result of fads or fashion. This allows the spiritual or mental aristocrat to step off the hamster wheel of liquid modernity. This will be done by psychological conditioning, yoga, spiritual training, and more. This new group of mental scientists will have a competitive advantage over everyone else in that everyone else will be dealing with crippling mental health issues that hamper their ability to act in space. The spiritual aristocrat has no such impediment. Imagine a man in a hazmat suit who was able to enter a toxic containment breach to clean it up, but in a mental context. His opponents are walking around in toxic chemicals with no protection. The results are foreordained. Such a movement will be better able to deal with declining eroids and the debt crisis as they shift value from the possession and consumption of stuff into the cultivation of higher things. The economic cost of transactions, coupled with inflation and the impenetrable maze of the cash nexus hemming you in, will make older forms of economic activity prohibitively expensive. Forms of economic activity outside the cash nexus, which is outside of the cash exchange, will develop of necessity, ranging from barter to labor swapping agreements. The spiritual aristocrat will be better able to not only envision a world of economic activity outside cash exchange, but also better able to keep track of people of virtue and merit who can be trusted to live up to their end of the bargain rather than cut and run. Cash is used as a medium of exchange in a low trust setting between strangers. Spiritual aristocrats will both embody and be able to identify high trust values in others. So you can have economic activity based on essentially promises between these individuals or people below them underneath their jurisdiction. And you won't need to have, money. It's just assumed that, well, okay, I did this for you, you'll do this for me, and we'll have some sort of accounting measure to measure the utility. The spiritual aristocrat will have the presence of mind to see the world as it is, specifically the entire structure of exchange, infrastructure expansion, and technological development. This will be able to identify pressure points and target them specifically to bring down the system. This can all be done in totally legal ways, and often in ways the system cannot even itself see. Such tactics might be union organizing, strikes, boycotts, sniping employees. By snipe, I don't mean shooting them, but by giving them better deals to take them to your side. But more to the point, by offering a sustainable mode of economic activity that exists outside the ever-constricted viability of the cash nexus and energy-hungry industry. This mental rootlessness in permanent things will form a center for people to revolve around as the fragmented social relationships between the sexes and the races develop into conflict and extinction. By being able to both see the bigger picture and step over the conflicts that exist almost entirely at the level of the physical, by elevating it to the mental, the spiritual aristocrat is able to outflank the opposition. As the inflection point crisis develops, the spiritual aristocrat will also be able to hide in plain sight. By operating from an elevated platform and looking down on the world, he will be unreadable to the rest of society, and his goals and values will seem strange to them. He will not possess the traits, or more importantly, easily identifiable resources that others groups might attack him for in the crisis situation. He will be positioned to wait this crisis out. So to sum it all up, because he's got this bulletproof mind, and he doesn't then, because which is the foundation for the developing spiritual science or mental science, he then won't be vulnerable to the mental health issues that are plugging the society right now and the ability to make decisions. So yeah, that's the pitch. We'll open up with you, Florian. What are some of your thoughts on this pitch?
Yeah, it's a very interesting pitch. I was I'm coming from the two books, The Sovereign Individual and the Network State by Balaji Srinivasan, and the Sovereign Individual is by Rees-Mogg, and I always forget the second author, so forgive me for that. But basically, they say, and they've predicted that, like I think Balaji like 5 to 10 years ago, and Rees-Mogg 20 or even 30 years ago, that thanks to the upcoming computer technology and internet, we will have a transition from the bourgeoisie that was tied to capital in the industrial age, to assets that were localized, into a sovereign individual, and or a network founder in the information age, right? So basically, what we had in terms of the old bourgeoisie had physical capital. They could wield their and leverage their power through nation state citizenship. There was national laws, and they ended up mass market industries, and you had basically loyalty to nation class, which actually replaced the loyalty to chivalry virtues, right? So basically, before the nation state and industrial revolution and the gunpowder invention and so on, we had chivalry rules, we had feudalism, right? And that was now replaced by the citizen of a nation state, right? But that also is waning thanks to the power of technology, basically, right? Technology in evolution makes the old bourgeoisie obsolete to a certain extent, at least we have, instead of physical capital, we have digital capital in the future. We have, instead of nation states, we have global mobility and encryption, right? These people, they don't have a loyalty to a state. They have a loyalty to their in-group, which can be international, right? There's no real borders online. If everything is decentralized, networks will be aligned with specific niches, and loyalty will not be to a nation state, but to an ideology and a network. And in that case, it's very interesting that you brought up the new class of mental and spiritual aristocracy, because that is basically another viewpoint to look at that, right? Um, so mental aristocracy is just a different version of the sovereign individual, and we can already see that now. There's a whole branch of the pro-Trump alliance that calls themselves MAHA, right? Make America Healthy Again, and they came actually most of them came from the left, right? And they are about after the COVID spectacles, the COVID failures, the vaccination, which opened the whole vaccination debate. They're basically in favor of making the whole nation healthier by, also taking the one actual thing that MAHA is about is taking soda purchases off food stamps, right? So the state doesn't subsidize people living unhealthy, right? So you shouldn't be able to buy Coca-Cola on food stamps and stuff like that. So that is, and then RFK Jr. had also promised that he will reveal, or that the Department of the HHS department, right? The health department is basically will reveal in half a year what really the origins of autism are, because it seems to be that we now have like 1 in 30 kids have autism, and that was down from that's up from 1 in 10,000 or a number like that. So basically, when Todd, when you said we have to be able to withstand mental health problems, that is exactly what MAHA already tries. If you now believe that's good, or that they can do it or not, there are attempts to do that. People now focus on the health of people, not just the nation as a nation state being able to defend itself against outside enemies, but also to live better from the inside, right? So, and that would be aligning with your thought of being able to withstand mental health problems, right? One thing that you also said, another good thing, was hiding in plain sight, the new spiritual aristocracy, because people will not understand them anymore, right? So basically, the tools they use, the language they use, they will kind of fly under the radar of most other people that are not part of that spiritual or mental aristocracy. And we have that already now too. We have, thanks to Bitcoin just being like, basically your wallet in Bitcoin is just a sequence of numbers, and so you don't know who actually has a lot of Bitcoin. So basically, you have stealth wealth. And people will certainly not divulge that they are wealthy, because then they get attacked immediately. So there are already people hiding in plain sight. Nobody understands them, because they also use their own language, like you could say, like crypto language and language of new networks and that kind of stuff. I want to put maybe one point of warning out there. Um, Spiritual aristocracy could be captured by techno-transhumanism, right? Because many things that you said could basically also be fulfilled by those techno-transhumanists, right? So that I can see as a potential problem, as Keith has reminded us several times, that the new tech oligarchy wants to engage in techno-transhumanism, and that could be, they could capture some of that spiritual energy in that spiritual aristocratic class.
Okay, Keith, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think much of what Todd and Florian have described is already happening now. If we look at, the best way to understand what's likely to happen in the future is to look at what happened in comparable situations in the past. That's not a foolproof method, but it's as good as anything. And as I pointed out on these programs before, right now is very similar to what we saw during past periods in history in a lot of ways. And I do think that a new ruling class is emerging that's over and above the historic bourgeoisie. First of all, the historic bourgeoisie has gone through multiple phases. We have the traditional ruling class in the West for 1,000+ years was the feudal royal elite. But then we started to see the rise of the mercantile bourgeoisie and the agricultural bourgeoisie, and then the industrial bourgeoisie, and then we saw the financial bourgeoisie, and I would argue today the new financial bourgeoisie, as well as the digital bourgeoisie, are starting to become the hegemonic forces. For instance, if we look at a lot of the conflicts that have taken place within the ruling classes for quite a while, we see a lot of it was a conflict between the financial bourgeoisie and the industrial bourgeoisie. In the United States, that's the Northeast versus the Sun Belt conflict. In Europe, it's between the banking elites and the industrial elites. That defined intra-ruling class conflict for a long time. But now that we have the new financial elites that have emerged, and we see the digital elites that have emerged, it's interesting because those sectors first started to align themselves with the financial elites. Like they tended to support the more liberal to the left parties in various countries. And like I know way back, I guess it was in the 90s, David Brooks wrote about the bourgeois bohemians and how you had this class of elites that were rising, but had kind of countercultural values and lifestyles and stuff like that. And initially, you had this new wave of hedge fund managers and tech entrepreneurs and all of that kind of stuff that were aligned with the political left, which at the time was controlled by the financial elite wing of the elites of the capitalist class. I'm using the term left broadly, obviously, and that's what those bourgeois bohemians and people like that were. And it was these people that started to promote the ESG and DEI and all of that kind of stuff. But in the last 5 years or so, we've seen a lurch rightward where those same sectors are starting to eclipse the old moneyed financial elites, and they're starting to move rightward. And now they're co-opting the industrial capitalist class as well. And I think a lot of the growth of the nationalist or populist movements we've seen in the West has been made possible by that. It's like this rising new elite class, a mixture of financial elites and digital elites, has first embedded itself in and then co-opted and then overrun the liberal wing of the ruling class, and now they're doing it with the more traditional conservative industrial bourgeoisie wing of the ruling class, or what Thomas Piketty calls the Brahmin left and the merchant right. First they came to dominate the Brahmin left, then now they're coming to dominate the merchant right as well. And these folks do strike me as becoming the equivalent of a class that's superseding the historic bourgeoisie. And they also prefer new political forms. For instance, when the bourgeoisie came to power in the 18th and 19th century, we saw the rise of republicanism, where traditional aristocracies, monarchies, and theocracies were discarded, and we saw democracies and republics and classical liberalism and all of that kind of stuff. But the new ruling class, in some ways, is going backward in the sense that they seem to prefer a more monarchical type of system or autocratic type of system. They prefer a system with themselves as a de facto aristocracy, that is, a state-privileged elite that's over and above even the normal capitalist class, which is also a state-privileged elite, but they're trying to ascend to the upper levels of the elite, where they're over and above the normal capitalist class. And there's other sectors involved as well that I think prefer something of their own that's similar to a theocracy, but not a Christian theocracy or an Islamic one. And then and you see that they're working to engineer this in different countries. We see that We've seen the rise of autocratic political systems in recent times around the world. Whether we see guys like Viktor Orban, or we see Putin or Erdogan or Donald Trump seems to be leaning in that direction. And there will probably be other figures like this, in the future. Certainly MBS and figures with that kind of tradition is already well established anyway. So it's clear that this new ruling class that's emerging is going to be a type of modern aristocracy that prefers a more autocratic political system and a less liberal one. And in some ways, I think it's analogous to the French Revolution. Now, the way I'm going to outline this will probably sound counterintuitive, but we could argue that if we look at the different ideological frameworks we see in the ruling class today, we could argue that the woke Malthusian types are actually the most conservative sector if we describe conservatism as either the Joseph de Maistre reactionary traditionalist philosophy or the Edmund Burke, kind of pragmatic traditionalism, because what I've called totalitarian humanism in the past is in many ways just a secularization of old school religious ideas, Protestant pietism, and that kind of thing. And then the ones that are really into the environmental stuff and Malthusianism, whatever else can be said about that, it represents a kind of tragic vision. It's a type of pessimism. But if you look at, and then we could say that the neocons, who, until recently, the most immediate competitors to that were the radical neocons. We could say that the woke totalitarian humanists are like Jacobins, but then the neocons were like the Girondins. They were an even more extreme viewpoint. It went into this global revolution and that kind of stuff. But what seems to be coming along nowadays is almost like the Thermidor reaction. Like we're having a new ruling class that's emerging that in many ways is reactionary. It's royalist and autocratic and aristocratic, but it's also extremist and modernist and this transhumanist stuff that Florian was talking about is an even more radical position than totalitarian humanism. Like transgenderism is a conservative position compared to transhumanism. It's like not only can you change your gender, you can change your species. So. And it's in many ways, it's also, a lot of people on the left like to compare it to fascism. And it is similar in ways because it's a type of movement that's modernist and yet anti-egalitarian and anti-liberal at the same time. And it's also scientistic, and it has this kind of fixation on transhumanism in the same way old school fascism was into Italian futurism and eugenics and that kind of stuff. So we do see this kind of new post-bourgeois ruling class emerging. I think that's correct. And also parallel to that, the trend in the 19th and 20th century was towards ever greater centralized states. You saw prior to the 19th century, the norm was you had these empires that tended to be transnational. We had a royal dynasty ruling over multiple ethnicities and nationalities and ways that were fragmented and stuff like that, because it was really just all about royal families carving up their own territory, like mafia families or something like that. But then you started to see a move towards centralized governments representing a national state and an ethnic group and a common language. There was a lot of that in the French Revolution as well. Later in the 19th century, you had the rise of nationalist movements. And parallel to that, you had mass democracy and ever-growing centralized states and the ever-expansive public administration state. And that's been the tendency throughout the 19th, 20th century. But it looks like in different parts of the world, increasingly, the state is in decline, as Martin Van Crevel, Bill Lynn, people like that have pointed out, because we see the rise of non-state actors. We see more and more people transferring their loyalty to institutions other than the state. For instance, a lot of the MAGA people in the United States, they may loudly proclaim their Americanism, but that's not really what they're about. Their nation is MAGAism or Trump land or whatever. They could care less about America. the same is true with a lot of the left. You know, they see themselves as citizens of the world, or you know, they see the woke religion as their nation or whatever. And you find parallels to that all over the place. So we see the decline of nation states, and we see people fragmenting into these non-state cultures and systems and entities and institutions. And there's no reason to necessarily think that that's not going to continue to grow and expand in the future. And just as we have this new, autocratic, oligarchic aristocracy forming, we also see the rise of what's likely to be a new revolutionary class in the future of an overeducated underclass. I think this can't be understated, that in the developed world all over the place, not just in the West, but in the East, also you find the rise of a class of people whose class position does not meet their education level. And that's when you get revolutions. Like if you look at revolutions, that's when they happen, is when you have an overeducated class of an overeducated underclass. So we see all these things converging. We see this new ruling class, this emerging overeducated underclass, and the breakdown of state systems. We could say that the new, post-bourgeois elite, we could say they're like the bourgeoisie, when they replaced the historic aristocracy. And then we could say this new overeducated underclass is like the new proletariat, So, and then rather than the cultural and demographic and geopolitical trends being towards ever more centralized states, we see a trend towards decentralization. First, with the transfer from geopolitical unipolarity to multipolarity, but also just the breakdown of the state generally, the rise of fourth generation, fifth generation warfare, increased prominence of non-state actors. And all of these things are going to likely converge. So where in the future we're going to have major conflicts between the overeducated underclass and the new elites that we're seeing emerging now. And I think, Trumpism and some of these other things represent the coming to power of that. But it's not necessarily going to be like it was in the 19th century and 20th century with the mass revolutionary parties and like Marx predicted that that 19th century capitalism would be replaced by a more collectivistic, state-centric type of society. And I think he was right about that. If you look at the managerial revolution of the 20th century that came to power in collusion with the labor parties, the social democrats, the socialists, the communists, the national socialists, that's exactly what happened. So I'm inclined towards the view that when the real class struggle between the overeducated underclass and the new aristocracy heats up, it's not going to be about these mass party formations and that kind of stuff. There's going to be a lot of non-state actors involved, and it's going to be more on the fourth generation warfare model.
Okay, yeah, well, there's a lot to say here, and I'm going to further lean in and explain what I'm talking about here. So the first part is, for the Gen X, Millennials, and Zoomers, to varying degrees, what makes these generations different than all generations before, at least in the developed Western world and in parts of Asia, is the idea that you've been completely submerged in cyberspace. Now, on the one hand, that's, I think, one of the ratchets driving people's mental health issues. And we've seen with the collapse of the woke front with Trump that a lot of these people just kind of fell apart under pressure. So it is a filter that takes in a lot of people and just tears their minds to pieces. Think of like Warhammer 40K's Chaos Demons. But the men that come out the other side, that were able to use the internet constructively. I mean, you have basically the Library of Alexandria in your hand with this right here. It's the Library of Alexandria right there in your hand. And if you can use that correctly, you can pretty much do anything. So the sort of like, to use like, I guess, Marxian or socialist terminology, the environment that's producing this mental elite, this spiritual aristocracy, is cyberspace. And because society, even for people that are poor in the West, and I don't want to denigrate how difficult it can be, they're not struggling for food every day, right? I mean, they can still get enough food to not die tomorrow, unlike, say, sub-Saharan Africa. And that does give them time to spend time online, to start developing their mind and these other things in a way that you couldn't really do before, right? So these people that are coming out of this segment of our society, it's going to look like, I know it sounds corny, but like, like in a movie with like superheroes, where like all of a sudden a whole bunch of people that for totally random reasons all gain superpowers, and the rest of society is just left scratching their heads. Some of them are villains, some of them are heroes, and they just have to figure it out. It's going to have a vibe that feels very much like that, because these people just come out of nowhere. They're going to have these cultivated powers, which look like magic, which, Clarke's third law, any sufficiently developed technology is indistinguishable from magic. It'll look like magic. It won't really be magic, but for most people, they can't tell the difference, so it'll be magic. That's the selection pressure. And they won't be limited to, like, say, any one class region, because the access to the internet isn't really conditioned by wealth, not the way that other things are. So you could be someone who's poor, as long as you have a smartphone or have access to a computer or a library, you could do this. And so you could this class that I envision developing will develop across all class strata, and will likely be leaders in both what Keith talks about as the overeducated underclass, as well as the current elites. You'll probably find more of these people in the overeducated underclass, because these people are operating way outside of anyone's paradigm. Then the second part I want to talk about is what would make them, what would make their identity, how would it be formed? Well, there's two things that are important. In Bertrand Russell's The Scientific Outlook, he says that as of his own day, nobody has a truly scientific understanding of the world. And by that, he means all the beliefs that a person holds are generated by the scientific process. Now, on the one hand, I think that there's a lot of metaphysical materialism and smuggling in of progressive ideas that Russell does, which a purely scientific outlook wouldn't necessarily give you. But as far as like a practical knowledge of the world and how to interact with the physical world and other people, you could envision an educational program that does prioritize that, giving people a kind of exhaustive scientific practical knowledge of all of these things and how they relate to each other. I think that's one mark you're going to see of this. The other one is, if you read Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes, now he's putting in novel form and easily digestible form many concepts that are a result of the traditional classical education, ideas like logic and reasoning and observation. So you do see them merging with the scientific as well. And so what ends up happening, imagine, because what you have to assume when you read a Sherlock Holmes story is that the world is fundamentally orderly, that these objects in the world that he's relating to solve cases, including people, have properties and relate to each other. And by understanding correctly the objects in the world and how they relate to each other, you can build a scientific and predictive model for how to interact with these things. And then thirdly, what that will allow you to do is to engage in long-term strategic planning over your competitors who don't have that kind of scientific or philosophical knowledge of the world. All of that is capital, but it's mental capital. It's not physical capital. It's not like something you can hold in your hand, right? It's mental capital, and it's revolving around two basic principles: an accurate understanding and knowledge of the world around you. And again, Keith, you mentioned how using history as a guide is still the best benchmark we have. Supplemented by that, and then you run all these essentially simulations in your head. Because that's what Sherlock Holmes does. He looks at all the evidence in a case, and he runs these simulations in his head to see what's the most probable explanation, and then he looks for more evidence to prove or disprove any theory. Now, if you have somebody who's been raised in an educational system like that, he'll have, frankly, magical powers compared to everyone else. Invoking Clarke's law, they won't be able to tell the difference. And so all of this capital now is mental. And there's no upfront cost, because anybody can just go to a library, to go to a computer and do this. And most people have enough money, at least, even amongst the poor, to have a smartphone, the Library of Alexandria in your pocket if you know how to use it. And so now what you've done is this mental capital now liberates so many people, because you don't have to have these large factories with enclosed property. So the monopolistic privileges of the state grants don't appear as efficacious or potent anymore. And now that you have this, and of course, for any competing businesses or nation states, they can't shut down the internet. They can't shut this down because it's the most competitive way to get ahead. You have to keep the infrastructure going. So now the state, which is guaranteeing the infrastructure for all of the big tech companies, is actually undermining these groups because it's creating an environment in which you have a low cost of entry to acquire some very valuable mental capital. And then using that, I would propose then that this new class, this mental aristocracy, could then rise. And then, one of the things that I said, it might be, they would probably be the leaders of the overeducated underclass. But I feel like that what they would do is we would see a paradigm shift. So if you were living in the Middle Ages and you wanted to envision a world in which you had mega corporations that were rule the world and had states in their back pocket and had 24/7 propaganda campaigns called ads, they wouldn't even be able to conceive of it. It would just be so they couldn't even conceive of it. It would be beyond their conception. And I feel like that this rising class has the power to shift the meta as much in ways that we can't even begin to envision. But it's precisely that leverage that allowed the bourgeoisie to take power the first time, displacing the what we might call the aristocrats of the flesh, who used swords and horses. This new class that I'm proposing would have a similar level of leverage over the merchant class because they're expanding our understanding of the world in a way that is inconceivable at present, except to the greatest visionaries and poets. Florian.
Yeah, many good points from both of you. I would first like to address what Keith said when he said that the past ruling class, they when they emerged, they kind of kicked out the monarchy, but not always, right? I think that the relationship is very complex because if you think back to the 19th century, after the Napoleonic Wars, Europe was realigned, right? And so that happened in the Vienna Congress, which happened in 1819, 1820, or 1818.
It was 1815, Florian. 1815.
1815?
Yeah.
Okay, I was wrong, but it was the Vienna Congress, and they basically realigned much of the European world back to the structures they were before. So basically, they didn't really kick out the monarchy as a principle. They just occupied the existing structures because the French Revolution was at that point just 30 years away. Many of the people that survived to 1815 probably still remembered, probably maybe even young people at the French Revolution, now elderly people, and they turned the clock back. And then what happened? You had these mass movements of democracy, liberalism, nationalism in the 19th century. And if you look at some authors like Thomas Mann have described that in books like the Buddenbrooks, they basically have said, look, the Buddenbrooks were a mercantile family, mercantile bourgeoisie, if you wish, and they basically got destroyed over time in 4 generations by several wrong decisions and mismanagement, but also the times were changing and they weren't able to leverage any power anymore, right? So the rise of democracy, nationalism, liberalism was the downfall of a lot of the mercantile class, and that means that they were still aligned somewhat with monarchy principles, I think. So another question that I was asking myself when Keith brought up, is MAGA movement really is that pro-American nation state, or is it more like a pro-Trump version? I think there's actually kind of like a civil war, not as much now, but there's like an internal conflict within MAGA because some people are civic nationalists that think that American rule in America and everyone can come here and be American, and we just need to have civic rules. And then you have ethno-nationalists that say no, we need to be separating according to race or other or ethnicity or other biological characteristics, because there's no way, if there are different cultures, vastly different cultures in one place, then what happens is that that the common sense that's prevailing is that of the stronger faction, not the common sense of the people that were originally here, right? So there are two aspects: the civic nationalists and the ethnic nationalists. Now, the ethnic nationalists, you would maybe think they're more in favor of integrating MAGA with a nation state because they're more about living with the soil, living from the land, and so on. So it's also more complex. I don't think that MAGA is generally only a pro-Trump personality cult. There are aspects of that, yes, but it's not everything, right? But it's a very complex they're very complex relationships here. And one thing I agree wholeheartedly is the overeducated underclass. That's something that has traditionally driven revolutions. And I think the red pill and similar movements were an expression of that already. Because most of the people in the red pill, they were frustrated managerial people, right? And they say basically like, fuck that. And some of them even went also MGTOW and so on. So as far as revolutions go, it doesn't need to be violent. It can just be people leaving society. It's a silent revolution, and if you have too many of those people just leaving society, then what we know of society will also break down, right? Because it's not driven anymore. If you have managerialism without the managers, they're all doing their own thing, right? And now what Todd said, that Gen X, Y, Z are different than all other generations before, is also true. We are submerged in cyberspace much more. We know we can navigate, all of us can navigate online. Generation Z can probably navigate much better than Generation X online, but we can all handle cyberspace, right? And maybe Gen X has an advantage over Gen Y and Gen Z because we still know a non-digital world, right? So we're not getting lost in cyberspace. But one could also argue that books like Ready Player One is our future. In Ready Player One, is basically the premise is that we all live with our own avatar in a virtual reality, and everything is possible. You know, and we're not really living in reality anymore. We're just projecting our mind into a virtual reality future. And now, if you look at VR, was like all the rage. Like people said, "Oh, we have the new VR computer sets, new headsets coming out." The Apple Vision and Facebook had something similar, but sort of that never has really taken off, right? So these Apple glasses, you know, you saw people in the subway there and some promotional videos, but I don't really see people like that. So it takes a while to take off, and that could be a part of what Todd also said. Could point to something Todd also said, that there's an energy problem, right? So basically, VR uses a lot of energy, and the reason that we don't see VR taking off as much as we might have thought like 10 years ago could also be for some small reason the outcome of extreme energy hunger, which is going to be a problem if everyone was going to be in VR. Then this would place huge problems in terms of energy use, and maybe the observation that VR is not taking off could also be a hint of that. So then, yeah, Gen X, Y, Z can live in cyberspace, but the question is, how much will we live in cyberspace, and how much will we still be connected to the reality? Is there going to be a hybrid model out there, which I think that will probably happen because everyone needs food, right? So maybe if you're an autonomous sovereign individual, then you band together with other people who can then provide food on like a micro state level, right? So you need to be somehow still linked to reality. And yeah, that's and one observation that I had, one thing came to my mind when I saw The Time Machine by H.G. Wells in the 80s, the movie for the first time. I think movie was with Charlton Heston. The guy who writes in The Time Machine stops the time machine sometime in the future, in the year 2200 or something, and he finds speaking rings in the library. And those rings can basically tell him all about the history. And I thought, that is miraculous. When will we have speaking rings? That sounds so far-fetched. But yeah, we have that now with our phones. We can say, Siri, tell us the history of the last 100 years, and Siri will tell us the history. So that's exactly that And it's very interesting that that we basically have a future foretold by a fictional movie in a way.
Yeah, Keith.
Well, it's interesting that the Congress of Vienna was raised because I was just discussing that with someone yesterday. There's a lot of people who associate the rise of the populist nationalist movements of present times with fascism. And I was arguing that a more appropriate analogy might be to certain things that happened in the 19th century, because we could say that in many ways what we see now is similar to the Congress of Vienna, where we saw a sort of a turn towards a reaction after multiple decades of radicalism. But at the same time, it wasn't really reaction because it didn't really go back to the pre-Enlightenment era. The Enlightenment proved to be pretty durable, and even after the Congress of Vienna, there were still elements of the Enlightenment that remained. And it's also true that so far at least, the contemporary pushback from the right hasn't really been able to repeal the 1968 Cultural Revolution. For instance, if we look at some of these new oligarchs, if we look at guys like Elon Musk, these are guys that have, they're, like Peter Thiel is gay married, and Elon Musk has his harem of baby mamas and all of that. This is not traditional conservatism. These are not people who represent, say, the mores of the 1950s at all, and nor does Trump. So we haven't really seen counter.
The Hugh Hefner right, is that it, Keith?
Yeah, exactly, right. Yeah, it's basically the Hugh Hefner right, so we haven't really seen a pushback to say pre-1968 at all, but we have seen a move toward a rightward move, towards reaction, but not conservatism per se. And that's very similar to what happened at various points in the 19th century. The Congress of Vienna was one. I think another time period that's very analogous to what's going on now was the reaction against the uprisings of 1848, what the Marxists call Bonapartism, because of Louis Napoleon Bonaparte III coming to power in France. And I think that Trump is very much a Bonapartist type figure, as are some other similar figures around the world, because they represent this coming to power of reaction in a way that's not inherently conservative. In fact, I think Napoleon III even called himself a socialist. So it's not reaction. It's not conservatism. It's not a true restoration of the past. But it is reaction in the sense that reactionary movements often represent groups in society that were once dominant, but are losing status, losing power, losing influence. And I think that the populist nationalists and movements like what Trump represents very much represent that. For example, back in the 1990s, Sam Francis wrote a book called Leviathan and Its Enemies, where he talked about the post-bourgeois proletariat. And it's basically talking about how neoliberalism and other things had the effect of re-proletarianizing the working to middle classes that had sort of defined middle America for decades. That book wasn't published until something like 20 years after it was written, and Francis had already passed away. But I think this post-bourgeois proletariat is really a lot of the demographic base of things like MAGA and that kind of stuff. But all of this represents groups that were once in decline, once dominant, but in a state of decline. Whether it's low status males or males who are losing status, the incels and that kind of stuff, or whether it's the post-bourgeois proletariat. And a lot of people from the left will say, well, Trump's movement isn't just like proletarians. They're actually, you find a lot of petty bourgeois types. They'll talk about the number of J6 defendants who were real estate brokers or whatever. And I'm like, yeah, but that's sector is still in a state of decline. Certainly, even if not economically, certainly culturally and demographically. And I think in many ways Trump is a kind of Bonapartist figure that represents these social forces that are in a state of decline, but also represents a rising ruling class that's increasingly hegemonic. Bonapartism was about that to some degree. You had divisions within the ruling class and irreconcilable conflicts within the ruling class, and ultimately a faction of the ruling class stepped in and said, "Well, this is how it's going to be." And they did that in part by appealing to reactionary artisans and peasants and all of that. But even if those sectors continued to remain in decline after that, it represented a stabilization of the bourgeoisie as a class without really going backward to traditional conservatism or reaction. And that seems to be a lot of what's going on in the world right now. It's very 1851 or 1815. I don't think it's quite as extreme as say 1932 yet, but and parallel to that, as this new ruling class emerges, Florian mentioned Balaji Srinivasan. I actually wrote a book of Srinivasan. I wrote a review of Srinivasan's book. It's on the attackthesystem.com website, where I review that book, and then I compare it with other similar works or comparable works by other writers. But it seems that these people that are, they're called the neo-reactionaries, the Dark Enlightenment, they do have a new model of society they're trying to advance, where bourgeois, democratic, republican liberalism is replaced by this thing that, I call it the neo-reactionary, corporate monarchist, techno-feudal, transhumanist paradigm, which on one hand, it's more decentralized in the sense of having these kind of corporate city states with a corporate monarch, and then all of these tech bro guys sort of rule over their personal fiefdom with smart cities and AI surveillance systems and that kind of stuff. And that may well be the model of society that continues to emerge, and that overlaps with the network state concept and all of this kind of stuff. But in many ways, though, when we look at the rising class conflict, it seems like what they're actually doing with this stuff is creating a type of means of production or a mode of production that could, in Marxist terms, be seized by future generations of revolutionaries, which would be the overeducated underclass. It's kind of like the class struggle of the future is going to be between this new aristocracy, who's creating a new mode of production, and one that, like the historic bourgeoisie, brought about sweeping, far-reaching changes, socially, culturally, technologically, economically, etc. But then it produced this revolutionary class in the process that ultimately became the source of class antagonisms. But in a way that is a new geopolitical framework and a new socio-political framework where traditional states are breaking down, unipolarity is breaking down, and we're moving towards something where non-state actors are likely to be more prominent, and that overlaps with this kind of network state, corporate fiefdom idea that some of these people promote. But it also represents overlaps with the rise of fourth generation warfare, and things like the revival of urban terrorism and stuff like this Luigi Mangione guy. We could very well have many more Luigi Mangiones in the future, just as we had all of the assassins, the anarchist assassins of the 19th century in the propaganda by the deed era. So it's like we're back in the 19th century. We've experienced the digital revolution. We've experienced the woke cultural revolution, just like the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, and then we've experienced our Jacobin moment, our Girondin moment, our Thermidor reaction, our Bonapartist moment, and we're moving towards the same kind of multipolarity that existed back in those days as well, with the same kind of class antagonisms and and terrorism and that kind of stuff.
So the thing that I want to touch on again here is when especially with technology and the Industrial Revolution, when the bourgeoisie come in and they have all these machines, and they perform quote unquote miracles of science. Right? We heard that phrase all the time. Even the 90s. There was this sort of like religious quality to it. And I know, Keith, you and I talked about how World War One can also be seen as a war between the scientific religion. That was something that was commented on by Ernst Jünger. Technology being the new religion or metaphysics of the 20th century. Now that capital, of course, was not accessible to most people. So only the companies themselves, or states, or agents of companies and states, could have this technology, and that allowed the Europeans to conquer all these territories in Africa and Asia, because they're just nobody could stand up to them. But if we imagine a new kind of capital, a mental capital, where obviously he's a fictionalized character, Sherlock Holmes isn't real, but the underlying theory behind Doyle is that if you have a properly educated mind, you can solve all sorts of problems to a degree that looks like preternatural ability to normal people, but it's actually the result of a carefully chain of reasoning based on an education. Now, I would argue that if that education were intentional, and you had an organization or a community that intentionally educated its young people this way, again, invoking Clarke's law, third law, right? It would be seen as magic by everyone else, even though, of course, it's just a highly developed form of technology or science, not necessarily technology. Well, it's a kind of human technology in the sense that these powers are, cultivated and concurrent with the people, right? The individuals using them. And so, to use as a hypothetical scenario, right? Individuals trained in this fashion versus everyone else, all things being equal, will have this competitive advantage over time, because they'll be able to solve problems consistently, reliably, without too many setbacks, without having to spend inordinate amounts of energy. And in the long run, they may not be noticed immediately, but over 100 years or 200 years, there'll be this ratchet effect where they will have this huge head of steam behind them. And they will look like magicians in the same way that the guy that comes from the company and shows you this mechanical device that can slice bread looks like a magician to somebody living in 1850. And that's the kind of level of change that I'm proposing could and in fact will occur. Florian.
Yeah, good points. I think one thing that Jacob Rees-Mogg and his co-author, forgive me, I always forget the name of the co-author, but they said in Sovereign Individual that basically they envision a future where the developments from that led to the change from monarchies in the 18th century to nation states in the 19th century would be reversed, right? And can see that to a certain extent happening. As far as the dissolution of nation states go in favor of digital sovereignties. But the 18th century monarchies were consolidated nation states as well, right? So will the new sovereign individuals and tech laws look at more fragmented empires? It is the fragmentation just a byproduct of digital sovereignty, right? Because based on how many people can realistically be part of one group, like the size of nation states and the degree of centralization could be or is certainly the outcome of a balance between powers. And with digital technologies, the results are just smaller nation states, smaller digital sovereignties. So if we roll back, from nation states to more, if we roll back past the nation state phase, we don't really need to end up in a complete fragmentation of feudal kingdoms, right? We can basically have some intermediate side, right, between the large part of nation states and feudal kingdoms. We can have like an intermediate part, and in the end, I think after that has happened, we will have this will be sort of locked in place too. The thing is that people will be able to be more mobile online, and they can basically be part of one group or another and can change that. So there will be a dynamic balance, but it will be in dynamic equilibrium. At one point, you have as many people going to that certain group as they are leaving that group for different digital sovereignty. I think that can happen so that people are mobile. You can be socially or digitally mobile, but we'll still have very entrenched structures because these systems will create some hierarchies, and this will be locked in place. But people will still be able to move between different sovereignties. They will not be locked into a certain nation states, but the sovereignties will be stable at one point, I believe.
Keith.
Yeah, well, I do think different types of political institutions are going to emerge in the future as nation states and states generally, like the Westphalian model of the state. I think that's in the process of breaking down, and that will probably result in other types of political entities that are rooted more in the rise of the non-state actors I'm always talking about. If we go back and we look at history again, we can see that there's a lot of historical prototypes for political arrangements like polyarchies, where there's multiple competing poles of government rather than a central government, or polycentrism, where you actually have competing systems of law within a particular geographical region, like a lot of the Middle Ages was set up like that. You also have what's called personarchy or personal law, like you found examples of that in some traditional Indians and societies, as like South Asian Indians, as well as in the Ottoman Empire. And you also we see plenty of historic examples of city states and regional confederations and that kind of stuff. And I think that things that might be analogous to that, maybe not that exactly, but things that are analogous to that, will probably come out of the rise and growth of non-state actors in the future, and the eclipsing of traditional Westphalian type nation states by those. So I think that's probably very likely. And then there's parallel to that with the economic and technological features involved. I think that probably one of the things that's going to facilitate this, obviously, is technology. But then we're also going to see the growing economic conflicts in which this takes place. Just like we saw the rise of the bourgeois nation state in the 19th century, along with the rise of the bourgeoisie as a class, we're probably going to see, as class power shifts, we're probably going to see changes in the structure of political institutions as well.
All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for being here. Thank you, Keith. Thank you, Florian. This was, I think, a really interesting conversation. So this is Ty Lewis of the Praise of Flight podcast, signing off.